All right, folks, I think we're going to get ourselves underway. I'm actually delighted to host all of you here today. It's exciting to see so many folks in the conversation. My name is Michael Diamond. I'm the academic director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications programs here in the divisions of programs of business at the School of Professional Studies at NYU. And I'm absolutely delighted that this gives me an opportunity to invite Jayson Council to our community. We've asked Jayson to talk about a topic close to his heart, and I know very much on the agendas and minds of many of our students and our colleagues, our faculty, and the professional partners we have around the impact of social activism and branding and social issues and branding and generally how these things align. Jayson, as many of you may know, is the head of culture for the Gersh Agency and is also, however, tapped into lots of different institutions, academic, nonprofit, media, marketing and advertising, really considered I don't want to say gadfly because that sounds too dilettante, but like a thinker and a mover and a shaker, and someone who brings a lot to these conversations. So I want to thank Jayson for joining us, and thank Robin Smith as well, who brought Jayson to our attention and for her work on pulling this together with Patrick Brady. The format is going to be looser than we typically have. I think Jayson has an interest in having as engaged a conversation as possible. So I'm going to hand it off to Jayson. If you have any questions or comments and topics, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So let's use the chat function this time. We sometimes use Q&A, but I'm going to monitor the chat. And so if it feels appropriate and organic, I'll pull those questions back into the conversation. Okay, over to you, Jayson.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Michael. And thanks again to Robin for the invitation, as well as Patrick for the setup. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Super excited to be part of your community today. I will not repeat every line that Michael said, but this is designed to be interruptive, right, with intentionality. This is your space. I've had the opportunity and the luxury to speak to countless groups. And I always say, if we talk about what I've done or what I do, we've wasted that time, right? So let's talk about how we can take some of the things that I've done and some of the things that I do, how we can put it with what your dream is from a professional and personal standpoint. Maybe we can answer some of those questions that are burning, some of those things that you just want to dialogue on. This is completely your space. I can give you a quick synopsis of what brought me here today and where I spend my time. And then I'm going to definitely turn the tables and say, hey, how do you want to utilize this time? How do you want to utilize this space? What are some takeaways that you want, right? We're all sitting at an intersection, right? It just depends on what's at your intersection. So today we're talking about that intersection of social impact and branding. That's an intersection I spend a lot of time on, and I'm sure you do as well. So let's figure out together, how can we galvanize as a community, move forward with some innovative best practices, and what we like to call some healthy differentiators between ourselves and the rest, right? So as far as my story, simple origins, right? I used education for the first 20 years of my professional experience as a Trojan horse, right? In the past 18 months, we hear a lot about DEI this, DEI that, and all these cool acronyms that go with it, JEDI and IDEA, and you name it, right? But prior to DEI, there were just very, very few, I would say, organizations that were doing it and doing it right. Typically, the functionality lived within HR, and it was about representation, and it was about making sure we can, if we had to, show that we were a diverse place to work, right? Not necessarily what the root of it is or what that's based on, but that's where it came about. So now that we talk about DEI and what does that look like, we want to figure out what are ways that we can implement these practices, right? So back when I was starting, the way to implement it for me was find a Trojan horse, find a way to equal the playing field. I thought education was a slam dunk approach. I felt if I worked with future leaders to give them access, to give them opportunity, to give them exposure to higher ed and opportunities post high school, that they would be set up for success. Now, 20 plus years ago, that made a lot of sense for where I was career-wise, right? Have always spent time with either an Institute of Higher Education and pre-college programming, a community-based organization working to empower future leaders, or I've been in philanthropy, either a family foundation or et cetera, right? So that was pretty much how I got into the game, and how I used the Trojan horse of education was, listen, I felt like if I were to get more dynamic BIPOC and allies into spaces to be the superstars that they are, then things would start to level set, right? So after 20 years of doing that and having some really enjoyable, successful stops along the way, there were things that were just part of my DNA and my default setting. Those things were impact, branding, marketing, because I've always been creative. So how can we take some of the best practices in media and entertainment and sports and fashion and all those industries? I was thinking, how could I utilize some of those practices in the nonprofit sector, in the social sector, in the civic engagement sector? In the 2019, after those 20 plus years of education that I spoke of, I decided to launch my own practice, which was adjacent consulting. A big thing that we wanted to do with my practice was to enhance the leadership of our executive leaderships. A big thing with what we want to get accomplished is making sure we have buy-in from the top, making sure the last stop on the train is bought in what we do and our initiatives. So with that being said, I felt that respectfully, I had done significant work from a grassroots standpoint. And at this point, I wanted to get into the treetops. I wanted to influence the influencers. I wanted to work with your executive leadership teams, your chairpersons, your boards, in advisory capacities and strategic advisories, and all those worlds. So I opened up my light and said that the shop is open. And for the first 12 months, I would say, the first year, for those who've ever started their own business, it can be dark, it can be cold, and it can be lonely, and you do a lot of stuff for free, right? So we'll leave that there. But the world over the past 24 months, 18 months in particular, has given us significant content, right? Has given us significant areas of opportunity, is what I like to call. Some folks call it crisis. I call it areas for opportunity, right? There was a lot of challenges that came about in the past 18 months, but again, a lot of opportunity. When we think of it from a media standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, we have all this intentionality and all these efforts, right, around pandemics. If it was a racial pandemic, if it was a health pandemic, if it were just any of the ism pandemics that we already had, that we were working throughout the course of our lifespans. What are we going to do, right? That's what it boils down to. What are we going to do? And at the moment when the door opened, DEI came about, and we all came through as practitioners. One of the things that was separate about my focus was DEI isn't what leads my practice. My practice is rooted in industry reset. You pick the industry, there's somewhere that needs to be reset, or something that needs to be reset. I utilized the term default setting earlier. It's important you realize what default settings are in this space, right? When we think about where we live, where we grew up, what it looks like to be someone who's living in this country. When we think about the default setting of our country, we think about misogyny, homophobia, racism, discrimination, just all those isms. These are our default settings, right? So what are we going to do now to offset the default setting of institutions? How can we appeal to institutions to make them even consider changing their default setting? I realized through my practice that it was monetization. How can we help our partners monetize? There's two streams of thought when thinking about monetization. There's financial, and there's also the human capital element of it, right? How can we start to help our industries, our sectors, be more collaborative, talk more, right? I feel with my experience in being part of the nonprofit sector and the independent sector and the for-profit sector, I felt that I would be able to be a conduit to take some of the best practices from each and start to implement them at a high level. One of the things that was critical to me within that space was realizing the identity crisis amongst sectors, right? So the identity crisis among sectors is really interesting because if you spend time in the nonprofit sector, if you spend time in philanthropy, you'll realize that there's a pining and a longing to adapt practices from the for-profit sector, from businesses, right? That's when you see social purpose business and you see all these bottom line approaches to maximize resources in the sector, to be as business-like as possible. But then you also see in our business sector, you see this same identity crisis of adopting these nonprofit soft skills, thinking about the mission, thinking about leading with your heart, thinking about how people feel, all things that the for-profit sector was not too interested in, right? But now they are. So now we have this opportunity to create these new stories. I'm talking to a group of people who not only make the news, but are going to report the news as well, right? So that's important. No matter what sector you go into, it's not about that. It's about understanding that there's news that needs to be made and reported. How are we going to share out? How are we going to extend olive branches cross-sector in the spirit of humanity to bring folks into the mix? What are we going to do? So I utilized a couple approaches that I'll share with you under my practice, right? Which is industry reset and social impact footprint maximization. Everyone has a footprint. We talk about carbon footprints, turning the light off when you leave a room, having a hybrid vehicle. We understand carbon footprints, but what's your social impact footprint? And how are you maximizing it? There's a couple buckets that I like to fill when I think about maximizing social impact footprint. I utilize this across industry. It can be fashion, entertainment, sports, nonprofit sector, education, you name it. But there's just, some core buckets that we need to be mindful of. One bucket that's critical to me is thinking about what's our future of workforce? How are we making entry points for dynamic folks to join us in productivity at the workplace? How are we going to create robust pipeline opportunities to break the hiring mold at organizations and corporations that default setting has been rooted in exclusivity? That's one. Another bucket that we like to fill when we think about social impact maximization is philanthropy, strategic philanthropy. What does your corporate giving look like? How are you taking resources that you've earned and allocating them back out, right? And that doesn't necessarily have to be huge amounts of money, right? These can be micro contributions, they could be nano contributions, however you want to frame it. But how are you giving back philanthropically, right? So now we have that workforce, the future workforce, and what pipeline opportunities look like. We also have what we're going to call strategic philanthropy. Third, community engagement and activation. How are you engaging the communities that you work in? How are you developing hyper-local partnerships? How are you developing hyper-local community-based partnerships? What are you doing to make sure that you're activating and engaging the communities that you're working in? Fourth, DEI, right? I give it the air quotes because we lead with diversity, and I think that's the worst thing you can lead with. I feel like diversity can spawn representation, but more so it can spawn transactional, performative, non-sustainable, tokenistic rituals and practices. If you lead with inclusivity and equity and belonging, diversity will be a natural byproduct, right? So we don't have to lead with diversity. When we lead with diversity, we come up with strategies. Strategies don't work. One of the roles that I play is head of culture, and it's head of culture by design because we want to impact culture. We don't want to impact strategy, right? I learned a long time ago from wherever it came from. It was a great quote and it stuck with me forever. Culture eats strategy for lunch. And it does. When you work somewhere and they want you to start to work on you know, the strategy, make sure that it's tied to a culture, because that's the critical part. And as branders, as folks who understand the importance of being a bell ringer and an ambassador of sorts, it's critical to understand that part, right? So when we think about that, we think about learning moments, we think about opportunities for communities to come together. So those are like 4 pillars of what my practice consists of. The 5th pillar is what I call the reaction to whatever the world gives us, right? So last night I found myself creating some communications around conflict in Ukraine. And what does that look like? Earlier in the day, I spoke on links with some clients about suicide, right? Now, these aren't necessarily my areas of expertise. However, when you're brought in to work with a client and you understand that there's a footprint you want to maximize, you realize that all these things are correlated, right? So that's essentially where I spend my time and how I got there. I very much feel like I've spoken way too much, and I'm going to kick it to Michael to see if there's anything in the chat or if we have any good questions or anything from the audience. But please ask away. This is your time.
Well, I'm going to allow myself the professorial privilege of actually calling on people in the audience. So I know we have a few people, so just so some of you can get ready. Obviously, if you want to, if you have a question and you want to put that in the chat, then please make sure you do, and I'll pick it up. But I know Lillian Ajayor, who's one of our professors, and I have had a number of conversations around both cultural change and arguably some more specific DEI initiatives, and she's very active in this space as well. I wanted to ask her perhaps if she had some thoughts or responses. And then I know we're joined by Matt Solomon, who's part of our intersectionality lab, one of our graduate students working in this area. I would love to hear from him if he has some thoughts, and I see some others very engaged with the topic. So I also want to super quickly, as I missed the opportunity, we are joined by Martin Ehrig, who's the dean, the academic dean of our whole division. So I'm really pleased to see Martin and wanted to welcome him into the conversation. So Dr. or Professor Lillian, any thoughts you want to kick us off with?
Yeah, so thank you, Michael, for that warm introduction. Hello, everyone. And Jason, I've taken like multiple notes already. I had a couple of questions for you. The first one is this idea, this concept around default settings. How did you derive at that?
So I learned that, right? I am a student by design, right? Like yourself, taking copious notes. Anytime I'm in a space, I'm a sponge, because I feel like, what if that person in front of me, the universe sent as a vessel, right, to deliver a message? I want to make sure I get that message. So from a mentor of mine in the space, I learned about default setting. And it just stuck with me, because when we think about areas of nuance like DEI, we have to think about roots. What are the roots? What are the roots of DEI or racism or all these things? And when I started to think about those and having a conversation and learn about default settings, it's really important to realize that, right? Because if you're able to understand that everyone or every organization or every system has a default setting, you're able to build around it, right? You're able to figure out what are the obstacles, what are the areas for opportunity, all those good things. Another thing that goes with that, and that's a very fair question too, is power dynamics, right? I always like to acknowledge sources and big up my colleagues who are doing great work in the space. But I have a colleague, Cindy Suarez, who wrote the Power Manual, and she gets into power dynamics at such a high level. And when we talk about inclusivity and belonging, if we're not talking about default settings and power dynamics, then the conversations aren't going to be as strong as they can be. And any conversation that we have that's not strong is going to come at the expense of whom we serve. If it's our client, if it's our customer. So our inefficiencies do come at a cost. And you said you had a second part too. So
yeah,
go for it.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And my follow-up question is, how do you engage with your client to kind of talk about the default setting? Because I
Yeah,
want to learn how to apply this concept to my world as well.
such a fair question. There's a lot of buzzwords that get utilized in the space. And I like it because I'm an oversimplifier and I love to just be able to give a word, right? But being unapologetic and also understanding that if someone reached out to you or you got in contact with them about this line of work, then there's already a bell that's been rung and says that we are open to learning more about how we can change. Now it's up to you to find an approach that's rooted in authenticity and that's rooted in doability and sustainability that you can confidently say you can offer to said client. But one of the things that's really important is realizing from a starting point, it's a spectrum, right? And when we talk about DEI or inclusivity and belonging or whatever, when we think about it as a spectrum, you have some people that are entering the spectrum that are just now learning the acronym of DEI. They want to learn more, and that's great. They're welcome. You also have people out on the end of the spectrum who are talking about liberation and reparation and revolution. They're very much welcome as well. And then you have all this in between. So your goal as a consultant, your goal as a human, your goal just as a good person and someone who wants to dig deeper is to figure out how can you get all these folks and all these different parts of the spectrum in alignment. And I think the way to do that is to take a step backward to go forward and start everyone off to the best of your ability, understanding the language, understanding the cadence, having shared resources, right? I think all these things help build a community that as you grow and pick up steam along the way and pick up people along the way, this is now embedded in what you do. It's not a strategy. It's not an afterthought. It's not a one-off. It's embedded. And to this crew in particular, the big takeaway is this is part of the story, right? We want to capture the story. The monetization is in the story. We want to figure out how can we take that brand that you have and take that maximization of footprint of social impact and make those two align. Because once you're able to show folks that doing the right thing or having a voice is monetizable as well, if that's a word, then it changes the game, right? And it's also important to know your audience. Know your audience. A education partner is going to be different than a Fortune 500 company, right? So just know your audience and be unapologetic.
Thank you. That was brilliant.
No, thank you. Great questions.
I'm going to move it around a little bit if you're okay, Jason. We had a couple of folks in the chat, so I'm calling on Matt Solomon mostly because I'm deeply fascinated by the work the iLab is doing, and maybe he can also promote that a little bit and talk about what we're doing. I know you're very interested in that work, and then we'll go back to Yuntian, who had a question, and then Alice Elliott after that. So
love it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And Jason, thank you so much for this great talk. I've been to many of these presentations, and this is one of the best ones. Your ability to draw people into conversation, I think it's so important in this topic and in this realm. So like Michael said, I'm representing the iLab, which we are a very, very young initiative at the School of Professional Studies at NYU. And our goal is we're trying to bring in all the disciplines that are represented within SBS and help faculty and the students that they teach understand the intersectional elements of all of the different industries that they're working within and that they're teaching within. So to try to understand how this social impact goes beyond everything and how everyone who's a professional can bring these sort of thought processes and conversations into what they're doing. And my question for you, it's something that you had brought up earlier, but we're immediately branded as a new DEI initiative. And that they're like at most places, there are about 10,000 of these and they're popping up everywhere. And it's kind of hard to get people's attention because like you said, a lot of people just think that, you know, it's a ritual. Even the people that are engaged with it are engaging with it in a ritualistic way. So, you know, there isn't as much substance as we would like to see, especially when we're trying to critically engage with people. And more importantly, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach those people who have never really even stepped foot seriously in the DEI world. They're teaching, they're doing their job, but they haven't really thought about how these things are impacting students, the industry that they're working within, and beyond. And we're trying to find ways to engage with these people and bring them to the conversation. But they, you know, they think there's other things going on. So I'm wondering what your advice is on bringing those people in.
Matt, I love it. Fair question. So one of the things I'll kind of work backwards with my answer, right? One, make it where it's not about the office, but the work, right? The work is a shared service like human resource, IT, right? There's certain shared service departments at every organization that it's a no-brainer that this is what they do. They work with everyone effortlessly, right? If I have a problem with my computer, I go to IT. If I have a problem with something that's happening in my day-to-day, I go to HR. If I have a problem with the way something smells, looks, or tastes from a DEIB capacity, I go to your office. So one, make sure it's about the work and never about the seat or the office. Two, innovation, right? Curated innovation. And realizing that it's not about you and the office or your voice, minimize the airtime that you take up by giving that space to subject matter experts specifically for every single nuance, idea, theory, or process you want to unpack, right? So if you want to get into transgender awareness, or if you want to get into Indigenous celebration, if you want to get into anything and everything, you should have curated subject matter experts that you utilize for that space, and you just create a platform, right? So you almost want to be behind the camera, think production more so than anything. Also think consistency and language. Just because everyone isn't showing up right now doesn't mean they won't show up, right? A new saying that I don't know if I made this up, but just because it's not on the table doesn't mean it's off the table, right? Like, so just because folks aren't showing up in drones right now doesn't mean they won't show up. And when they show up, you want to be able to show that you've been there, you've been consistent, and there's a robust bank of resources and programming that's already been done. So when they come into the space new, they can see that this is a pre-existing space. There's a way I have to come in, there's a way I have to show up, etc. And that's the consistency as well, right? So just understanding you're a shared service. It's not about you or the department, it's about the function. Understanding the importance of language and consistency and innovation, I think will really help drive what you want, because this is very much a challenge by choice thing, right? This is a self-selective thing. You decide how you show up and what you want to take away. So just give opportunities, consistent opportunities. And the last thing I'll say before putting a bow on that is, I'm a big believer in micro deposits. Continuous small deposits. You'll look up, it'll be a year later, 2 years later, who knows what type of traction that you've got at that point. But you at least know you've done what you were purposed to do in that role, and the deposits are continuously coming.
This is fantastic, Jayson. I'm gonna go a tiny bit out of order because I know Omar Deacon had a question, and he also has to leave. Omar's a graduate of our program and an experienced marketer to boot as well.
Love it.
Thank you, Professor Michael. Hi, Jayson. Nice to meet you. And yeah, I mean, I have worked for the past 10 years with different brands, and actually one shift that I love to see in the brand management world is how many brands, regardless of their size, are moving from marketing to serving. You know, like stop seeing our consumers as consumers, but as the community that we serve. However, when it comes to younger brands, and actually right now I'm working for a startup that basically we ice cream, and we are, you know, it's still young, like 2 years in the market. It's a pretty young brand. How can we connect the brand to a true, authentic purpose, as all brands should aim now, but at the same time build the credentials that we need to build in the category. You know, like,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
probably for a brand like Gillette, it's easier to jump into a more purposeful campaign because we already know how good a Gillette razor works, right? But for young brands that it still needs to build that credibility, that superiority, and yeah, how do you manage that balance? You know, because yeah, it's super inspirational to build campaigns based on purpose, but at the same time, you need to manage a business and you need to base that business on a superior performance and a product that actually delivers.
I love it. Super fair question. I'll start with culture, your internal culture. Before you face outward with these flags that you want to wave about purpose, make sure everything's okay at the house, right? Make sure your house is clean before you start to wave this flag, right? So once you make sure the house is clean, and by clean, I mean you have a culture that has embedded DEIB, you have a culture that's inclusive, right? And everyone is speaking the same language at said place. If that's not happening, start to take those micro deposit steps to get that going, right? I like to give analogies and I'm an oversimplifier, right? So one of my cooking analogies is sometimes you have things that are crock pot. They're just simmering. You don't have to do too much to them. Just let them go, stir every now and then. But sometimes you have hibachi stuff. And that hibachi stuff requires you to be active over the stove, going hard for a long period of time, right? So think about the culture. How can you start to change the culture internally? If they have a healthy culture as a young startup, as a young organization, hopefully their default setting isn't one that's rooted in some of the isms that we discussed. So that should be working for you. 2, Mitch Anthony has a book called Selling with Emotional Intelligence. I'm sure he would be happy if I said buy the book. I won't say buy the book, but what I will say is the main part of Selling with Emotional Intelligence says that everyone has on a necklace with 4 words around it. Make me feel important, right? Everyone has that necklace on. So you want to figure out how can you make your client or who you're working for feel important. Get back to the monetization, right? Show them how you monetize in this space from a brand, like financial capacity, but also from a human capacity. People want to work here and people who work here want to stay here, right? Because all these things are critical. When you think about, and as branders, because I get it, I'm a brander, right? So sometimes we get so overexcited to really focus on the product and the brand that we don't think about how uninformed this partner may be, right? For Gillette, for example, you may think Gillette would be an easy land for a partnership for branding outside of conventional things, right? But they may be so established that it's difficult to unlearn some of their culture, right? Whereas this new startup company you're talking about, what you're saying may be very futuristic by saying, hey, here's how we're going to maximize. You want to compete against the Gillettes in a healthy way, or you want to go against whoever your competitor is, here's how we're going to do it in an authentic way where we lead with our heart, but we also know that money's involved as well, right? So I would just say, again, get back to consistency, innovation, but start internally with the culture. Make sure before you start to, talk to other folks about being inclusive, that it's happening at, where you are.
Yuntien, why don't I ask you, you had a great question that I thought would be good to get forward, about how you, impacting culture, etc. So Yuntien, if you're still on and want to come off on video, you can join with your question.
Hi, thank you, Michael. Hi, Jason. I have a relatively really basic question about the culture. I know companies nowadays are advocating their cultures to employees, but I want to know how actually we can form a solid culture in company, and what are the fundamentals of company culture itself?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. I think how you can form a culture at the company is more so, let's take it to a micro level and think about what can you do personally. We'll start with you. What can you do personally? One thing you can do personally is understand that you show up, right? And start to think about how it is you show up, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean your physical attributes, right? There's how the body you inhibit may inform, but doesn't shape your leadership, right? So thinking about what's important to you, what are deal breakers to you, and things that are important to you at the workplace, right? So if you are someone who is looking for an inclusive workplace, then you want to be inclusive as well, right? You want to find time to dialogue with folks at work that you don't know, right? You want to go above and beyond and introduce yourself to people you don't know. And I understand that in Zoom world, that's difficult. And as we have reentry, that's going to be a new challenge to deal with. But these are just kind of one size fits all best approaches. Just think about what can you do better to show that your light's on, you're cool, you're approachable, and you want to be the best possible version of you at work you can be, right? Then if you're fortunate enough to work places that have, some places they're called ERGs, employee resource groups. Some places they're affinity groups, right? You want to tap in with your HR to figure out what resources are available and already in place. Now, this can be a gift and a curse, right? It can be a gift because you're proactively seeking resources, but the curse can be you get the answer, which is we don't have any of that in place. And that's not even how we get down. We're not even thinking about that, right? So then you have a different set of questions. Is this the best place for me to work at? Do I feel I could reach my maximum potential here? Is this the culture that I want to align to my personal brand? We talk so much about our partners and who we work for, their brands, but what about your brand? What about your personal brand? Does this place align with that brand? So once you have that conversation with HR, because that's who, for the most part, is going to oversee these areas, unless you work somewhere that happens to have a DEI professional or whatever in place, you want to hear what's already happening. Then you want to join. You want to encourage people to join and be part of it. But you want to join from a place of what I call an aggressive observer, meaning you're participating, you're very much engaged, but you're also observing. How can this be better? Who's missing, right? What can be done to make this more accessible to other folks at the organization, right? So you want to figure out what they have there. And if they don't have anything, if you really feel strongly about it, then you want to start something. You want to say, hey, I would like to start an employee resource group for this particular culture. And what are the parameters? What are the boundaries? What are the criteria? And then you want to follow whatever the protocol or system is. You may be creating the system as you go, and there's nothing wrong with that. You may be inheriting a horrible system that you're going to have to tweak, and that's okay too, right? But it's just about being bold enough, confident enough, and resourceful enough to understand what that roadmap looks like for a healthy culture.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'll just add, I'm sorry, one last thing with that. It always boils down to what I call the last stop on the train, right? My NYU folks, a lot of train riders on here, we understand what the last stop on the train is, right? At an organization, that's a person. And if you don't have buy-in from that person or that team, then it won't work. So although I send you to HR, or if you're fortunate enough to have a DEI person or a chief inclusion officer, but if not, you want to see what are the ideologies and the practices of your leader, because those will be very, very clear, and you'll be able to see if this is even the type of leadership that would be interested in inclusivity or belonging or social impact.
Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you. No, great question.
Yeah, thank you, Jayson. I think it gets at the heart of what you've been talking about, and probably resonates with a lot of questions we were having about building culture, etc. Pleased to say we're joined by Alice Elliott, who is one of our distinguished colleagues from the Tisch School of the Arts, and herself an acclaimed director and filmmaker. So we're delighted to welcome her, and she has a fabulous question. Relating, I think, branding content to teaching, etc. Very strong advocates for disability rights and housing.
Yes.
And so we'd love to hear from you, and a distinguished teacher as well. So I think her question is probably more rooted in her teaching practice. But Alice, are you good on the mic?
I think so.
Yay.
Great. Because I'm teaching a production course and the students are actually making pieces of branded content, that was what kind of interested me about today's talk, which has taken me in all kinds of exciting directions. Can you talk specifically about perhaps some branded content that you've created that reflects these values and the process that you had in creating it, working with a client?
Sure. So wonderful question, right? And as you know, and as folks are going to learn, there's no one size fits all approach to it. It's very much curated to the partner that you're working for, what their voice is in the space, and if you want it to remain that way or change. So I'll take an interesting group that I worked with early in my practice. This was in response to, and it's okay, there was no NDA on this one, but in response to racial reckoning, one of our professional sports leagues had allocated a significant amount of money to what we're going to call DEI resources, right? So I was fortunate enough to be brought in to work with a group of professional athletes. We do not feel comfortable with what's happening in the world, and we're going to band together and we're going to use this platform and our voices to make change. Great, right? But these are football players who want to make change. They have a voice, but they don't know how to utilize their voice and haven't been given an opportunity to utilize their voice. So Alice, in this particular case, it was about making sure that folks understood what a voice was and where it can take them. And also understanding that this wasn't about football players talking at people, but more so an opportunity for these players to talk to people and to increase a community and to increase support, right? So what we had to do was we thought about what are our assets? Let's think about what are our assets? What do we have working for us and how can we maximize those? You know, I don't want to say like a SWOT analysis, but you want to do a SWOT analysis, right? The reason why I don't like to think about a SWOT analysis is threats. I don't want you to think of people who do what you do as a threat, because that doesn't foster community and it doesn't foster partnership, right? I gave a couple resources. Another resources I'll give, I'm sure folks have probably already read this, but if not, Henry Timms, New Power, right? Henry Timms, just super duper quick story about Henry Timms. He was a mid-level development professional at the 92Y. He was ready to leave his job. Him and his friends in the department were like, you know what, this place sucks. We have all these great ideas. Let's just start to go forward with them. One of those ideas was Giving Tuesday, right? So they discovered Giving Tuesday. Long story short, he became the head of 92Y. He now oversees the Lincoln Center, right? And his theory about old power and new power is very simple. The difference is in old power, you define what your competitive advantage is and you separate yourself and say, we do this better than everyone and we're going to go over here and just relish in it. Where new power is, we do this so well, but in order for us to do this even better, we need everyone to come with us, right? So a big approach that I had with this particular group is, you're amazing, you're football players, you're successful, but that's not enough. How can we take this beyond just football and beyond your footprint? And how can we start a coalition that's going to go cross sports, that's going to focus on hyper-local connectivity, that's going to focus on making these partnerships long-standing, right? So it was just about taking all the ingredients that they had and figuring out what would be the best recipe for them. And for them, it was about identifying their voice, harnessing their assets, and being unafraid to lead in the space and opposed to follow. And Alice, one thing I'll say quickly too, just because of your introduction, understanding that you work with housing and disability, when we talk about these areas of belonging and inclusion, the two that get left out the most just happen to be the two that any of us can be part of, right? Anyone on this Zoom can suffer from food insecurity, from being addressless, or from being disabled. So I think it's really important that we understand that as we have this heightened sense of equity, that we have equitable practices within equity.
I love a conversation, Jayson, when I end up with a reading list. This is wonderful. I'm taking
yes.
Yeah.
And I have more, Michael. So let's connect offline.
Yeah,
we'll make sure that we share
maybe
the resources with folks.
Yeah, we'd love to get a resource list around, and that whole definition about new power could take up a whole conversation in itself. I know it probably resonates with some of my colleagues. I'm looking at Tom Kennan here, who have worked on questions of ethics, etc. But Lisa Huang, who's a member of our team at SBS in the Division of Programs of Business, and also one of the leaders, I think perhaps leading our IDBEA council across the school to coordinate efforts, had a couple of questions. So I'm going to shout out to Lisa.
Right, appreciate that, Michael. Thank you, Jayson, for attending. I love everything you're talking about. I also am a big fan of simple analogies. I really loved your micro deposit analogy. Mine is small steps are still steps.
I love it.
Michael is correct. I'm co-chair for IDBA, and one of my colleagues on the committee is actually here, Zuleika Cuevas. She teaches intercultural business communications and organization. And she's been a powerhouse in this sphere as well.
Yeah.
I have two separate questions just because I'm that type of person. So the first one is a little bit more philosophical and predictive. So you mentioned the future of the workplace. Are there other future issues in the industry students should prepare for? And then the question is an educational one. So if you were to teach a course in the marketing department, hint, hint, everybody, what would be the topic and what would be the takeaway / learning goals for the students?
I'll start with the second, and I'll talk about, I would say, this is what I call first draft talk, right? This is just me literally first draft workshopping it, but it wouldn't be about the dynamism, right? Being dynamic. What does dynamism look like in this space? Right? Because I feel like dynamism is that linchpin for all those tentacles of influence and change. And so I would talk about how important it is for dynamism and innovation. And what does that look like? And kind of take it a little bit away from, I have 3 floors that I operate on. There's the floor, there's the ceiling, and then there's the clouds, right? I love to be in the clouds. Right. So taking it, and I'll tie that into the first part, which is the future part. I'm guilty as being a future caster and a futurist. And in that spirit, when we think about, you asked about the future of workforce, and I said specifically about what does that pipeline creation look like, right? So taking a university partner like at NYU and having that intentionality around how NYU graduates are deployed into immersive experiences that set them up for success long-term. I think the future is focusing on entry points. What are your entry points, especially for folks like us who work within higher ed in certain capacities and have the ability, the luxury, and the responsibility of helping to shape and enhance the future leaders of today's world. So I think really just figuring out those entry points, because a big part of what I attempt to do is I like for it to be doable, right? It has to be doable, right? Even though it's in the clouds and it's a dream, it still has to be doable. And I think what's the most doable, best futuristic practice is to really focus on pipeline creation, but outside of transactional relationship partnerships, right? Having meaningful, long-standing partnerships with places where your folks can go. And not only are they gonna have a great professional experience, but they're gonna be immersed and supported in ways that are gonna not only take them to the next level professionally, but personally as well, right? I like when personal and professional blend together, right? I love when you don't have to code switch or get into character for what you do professionally. And when you're able to find out how you can merge those two in a way where they're not mutually exclusive, then you start to feel that much more purposeful in the work you do. So all that to say, dynamism and innovation in the space. The key takeaways would be, how can we be creative in curating experiences for our students to have the best practice, the most innovative practice, and the most limitless, bold approach to what we want to see take place?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
No, great question.
Inspiring. And the great thing about it is the students here, they are all practical, they want practical applications. They want to make impact in the world. So that's the biggest differentiator between SPS and other NYU schools.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. Again, like I shared earlier, you want to make it where it's not about you, right? It's not about you. You don't want to make it where every time your name, your email, your name comes up in the email, it's like, oh, here we go. Like, this can't be burdensome work, right? So the biggest thing you can do is know when to step up and know when to step back.
Actually, I think that's a fantastic segue to our next question from Nicole. You couldn't have set it up better, Jayson. Nicole's part of our, we have a number of programs, as you know, at SBS, and within the Division of Programs of Business, we have some deep specialties in marketing and communications, in technology and systems, and indeed human capital management and human. Under Professor Anna Tavis. So Nicole is part of that team, and I think had a question relevant to your last comment. So.
Yeah, thank you. I'm joining from my phone. I hope you can hear me okay.
I can hear you great.
Great. I do work very closely with Lisa, and our team is very focused on, the future of the workforce and diversifying that pipeline, making sure our students are educated and not just the D part of DEI, but also the E and I and the B. And so, and then, getting those students into organizations where they can enact change. And I think what I'm curious about, and speaking as an administrator, I know we have several NYU employees on the call. I think a lot of us are drawn to education because we already have an inclination for wanting to affect change. And I think we find ourselves limited a lot by the bureaucracy in higher ed. And so I'm very curious about how you spoke a bit about your experience in education before you got into what you're doing now. And so I'd love to hear more about your personal journey from education to what you do now, and how you really leverage your experience in education to enact and advance social equity.
Very fair question, right? So when I think about education, and the reason I got into it outside of the impact it had on me personally, was I felt education was the big neutralizer, right? It was the big stabilizer. It was somewhere that we can potentially, even if it was just in my mind, that everyone can come to and potentially be invested in and being supported and go off and do amazing things, right? I felt like that was that one point of entry where I can have the biggest bang for my personal impact, right? So that's how I got into it. And the reason why I stayed in it was because, like you all, right? When you have people that you are learning with, right? You're teaching, you're supporting, and you're growing with, it makes you feel so wonderful to be part of that. And I just was fortunate enough to work from pre-K all the way into post-college with my folks. So I got to see like legacy, like generations of my students who now have children, right? So it's like, there's something there that's so special. But personally, every step along the way, the fire underneath me grew that I could do more, right? And I started to feel almost like a superhero who knew he had these powers, but never used them, didn't know how to use them, and just wanted to like use them because I felt like a bull in a china shop. And every role, after every role, I started to feel more and more like that. And then eventually, as they say, pressure busts pipes, the pipe burst. And I realized that I want to take this microphone, right? And this is my marketing folks, take this microphone and turn it into a megaphone. And in order to do so, I had to think about what did that look like? And it was starting my own practice, because I just felt like what I represent and what I want to see happen was necessary in spaces and rooms that I wasn't in, right? I was in rooms preaching to the choir a lot, and that's not the best use of your time, right? Like, and you also, I mentioned this earlier, a big part of my education experience where it was all grassroots, right? Grassroots. And then I decided that I wanted to see what would influencing the treetops look like. If I'm gonna preach that the last stop on the train has to buy in and support all these things, shame on me if I'm not serving as a contributor to these last stops on the train, understanding what their responsibilities are, right? And understanding how this is the new cool, right? Like, this is the new cool. If you want to be innovative, if you want to be, you know, the dopest organization, what we're talking about now is the new cool, right? This is where you want to live. So I enjoy helping people rediscover what the new cool is, right? So education is what got me there and what keeps me, like, I'll always be in these spaces, right? Like, shout out to Robin. Robin reached out from you know, a colleague from before and told me about this amazing group. Anytime I have a chance to speak to those who are going to change the game, it's a go. It's an instant go. And this is what that group represents. One quick thing I'll share with you, because you brought up about not using the D and for DEI, and I love it. So Michael was kind enough to share an article that I had penned a little while ago, and I took DEI and I changed it around to DIE, right? I made it diversity, inclusion, equity. And then I replaced that DIE with 3 R's: representation, respect, and repair. So when you think about DEI, think about DIE. The diversity is representation. That can be good, bad, or in between, right? But it's representation. The inclusion is the respect. I respect you, so I'm going to include you. But the E, that equity, that's repair. And repair is like retention. For now, it's kind of unicorn-esque. We can't talk about retention until we talk about immersive opportunities for entry points. We talk about support, nurturing, advancement, right? Then we could talk about retention. We could talk about repair once we talk about representation and respect. So all these things are aspirational and they should always be on your radar, but just realize reparation, repair, and retention are very much down the road. Let's focus on these things that we can control right now: representation, respect, and things of that nature.
So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to wrap. I think we all could stay on for a lot longer, and we'll see if folks do or don't disappear. But just formally, I want to kind of bring the thing to a close and thank you profoundly for what's been a really dynamic and engaging conversation. And I'm now hesitant to use the phrase DEI, but I love your 3 R's. I think that's really a new way to think about things, and maybe the right way to think about things. It also moves us to more actionable, actionability as well. Has that capacity not to label things, but to talk more about what we need to do. So this has been an amazing session, as Evie and others have said in the notes.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you. A couple of questions we didn't get in, so we'll feed them to you, and a couple of people who would absolutely love to be in contact with you, Jayson. So maybe you want to let folks know how they should best connect with you.
Just LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where I live. So Jayson Council, Jayson. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I welcome all types of conversations, and I'll also send over a list of some of the resources that I referenced to you, Michael, and to Robin, and you can share that out as sort of a editor's choice type of thing.
Okay, we're going to do a shameless plug and advertorial for next week's talks, but I do want to thank you all. Next week, we have a fascinating conversation around sustainability from the perspective of companies in China. For many of you who know, we've been running a series over the last year or so around transforming marketing from the perspective, learning from China and across many dimensions. But one of the issues we thought would be interesting to tackle is this idea of what sustainability means in China for brands. So we've invited Richard Brubaker to join us next Wednesday evening, our time, early Thursday morning. So absolutely love to see this range and diversity of topics that our unit is able to take on, and also to welcome so many colleagues from outside of our immediate community, from the rest of DPP and the rest of SBS. So shout out to all of our profs and faculty, many of whom I see on the call, and students and colleagues from across the university. Many thanks, Jayson. Absolutely wonderful conversation. I think, in fairness to everybody, we'll probably just call a stop, if that's all right with you. If I'm voted off the island, someone else can have the hosting and keep the conversation going. So, but for now, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I look forward to remaining in contact with everyone. So please reach out. Have a wonderful weekend. Peace to all.